The agenda is talk about the current status, what's different about data science and data-driven products. How do you think about building the organizations? What are some of the patterns and anti-patterns? And I'll focus on just a few things, given that it's a short talk. But here's a really interesting perspective to start off with. This is from a bunch of sources, LinkedIn and others, that there are 250,000, half a million data scientists roughly in the world, growing that number. There are 22,000 companies marketing AI and data. Either they're saying they're doing some things in the space, they have AI products, or they have data products, or what have you. There are 26 million articles online that talk about ML and data, etc. There are 154,000 patents filed around AI. A lot of this has happened over the last decade. A lot of this, I've obviously my background's in NLP from Stanford in the early days, but later on, I've been trying to commercialize this since 2012, so 10 years. So I've seen this industry grow and change. And my best guess on how many of these companies, data scientists are actually successful is that I believe at this time, there are no more than 1,000 models actually in production that's being used by people, like hundreds or thousands of users. So again, contrast that with 22,000 companies saying they're doing AI, and there are no more than 1,000 models. These are all the models even at Facebook and Google. And so you can imagine how many of these ML models and data-driven products actually work in the real world, including the Fortune 500. And I also believe from my own survey, and some of this is anecdotal, but there are only a few products we use that today we all touch, like Google Maps and stuff, that heavily use ML as the underlying basis for their products. And I believe there are less than 250 companies, not the 22,000, that have actually cracked how to do this. And there's a lot of tribal knowledge. I think I'm one of those people and would like to sort of share what I've learned the hard way. And why is that? Why is such a disconnect? If I'm claiming there are 22,000 companies who are marketing AI and data as their core strength or product, and then I'm saying, hey, there's less than 10% of them, or really less than 1%, or about 1% of them that have actually cracked it. What's the disconnect, and why is there such a disconnect? And the reason for the disconnect is actually that there's a huge difference between building data-driven AI, if I may use the term loosely, machine learning-driven products, and other engineering types of projects, right? So if you're building a bridge, in 2022, there's a pretty good chance that you can build the bridge. There's a very low chance of failure, right? If you're building a mobile app or you're building a workflow application, at Regrello, we're building a workflow application as well as a data-driven part on top of it. With a pretty good team, as the other CTOs have talked about, I think I can get to not even 40% chance of failure. I think I can probably reduce it to 20% chance of failure. I'll be delayed by a few months, but I'll have something that works. There's still a chance of failure. You still need luck. You need really smart people. You need a great product manager, but you can get there. But in data science, I think the failure rate is very high. And obviously the idea here, 10, 40, 80, is it's just to give you a directional sense on the chances of failure. I think if I were to really understand what percentage of data science projects are failing, it may even be as high as 95%. But at my last penultimate company, we got to about 85% chance of failure, or 15% chance of success. And on the other hand, building a standard application, for us was like getting, 20% chance of failure, or 80%. So this is the problem, why you have to think differently about data-driven products and using ML in your application. And the best analogy that I can think about it is you should think about data-driven products, be it software, as more like a pharmaceutical business and not like software. And if you study pharmaceutical business, they have a pipeline. They're to get one blockbuster drug out or to solve COVID, they do like thousands of experiments in the lab, right? Which is very different than if you were building software. It's a different approach. If I was building software, let's say I wanted to build supply chain software, I would not try to experiment. You just invest more, you hire better people, and you can crack it, right? Whereas in data science, a lot like pharma, you can have the best scientists. You have to take on different approaches, different people, different paths to success. They may not be able to crack it, right? So it resembles a lot like pharma. And if you start thinking about it that way, you'll get a lot of things right. The pipeline, the phase methods, the different phases of development, I found it to be much more useful as an analog than thinking about it as software. And this may be a unique approach that we took, but I found it really working well for me. And the most important thing, there are only two things I've learned now being in startups and in software for a long time, mostly failing, but successful at least 2.5 times, is that there are two things. There's market and there are people. There's nothing really else there, right? So you have to think about, you obviously have to find the biggest market you can find, which is most open or most not open, depends on your philosophy. But then you got people, right? And I've learned a lot about building data science teams. About 15% of my last organization, so we had about 100 product engineering folks, about 15% were data engineers and data scientists, probably more, maybe 30-40% were data engineers, data scientists, but 15% were like PhD data scientists. And if you listen to Andrew Ng, who I think is the most brilliant academic in the field, he says, what you do is you have your product org, you have your engineering org, and you have your different lines of businesses. He gives a lot of talk on how to implement data science. And then you have your data science org, and there's a chief scientist or VP of data science. And I think that's completely wrong. Now, I obviously respect Andrew and quite a bit, but in my experience, not just working in my own companies, but also advising McKinsey's clients on AI, I think that's like a recipe for disaster. And I've learned a lot around how to think about the design. And the way that I think about the design is I have this, and this is again, nothing to do with data science. If you were, trying to innovate in any sort of field, this is my formula: is you have to have engineers, you have to have a product or a business lead, depending on, if the product was pharmaceutical drug, you have like a program manager or somebody like that. And then you need, a data scientist, and then you need a designer if it has UI and user interface implications, or a clinical scientist if it was a pharma or something like that, right? So you really want to be able to embed data science as part of your product group and not have it be siloed at all. In reality, they have to understand the business problem. They have to understand the context. And I don't really buy the hypothesis that data scientists, you can create a virtual organization where there's data scientists from the different products get together once a week, share their learnings. Maybe there's even a virtual leader who kind of manages the virtual group, but you want the data scientists as closely working with your engineers and with your product managers and embedded in your business organization or your product organization, rather than be siloed off. And if you start with the silo, it's never going to converge, in my opinion. The second sort of, going back to the pharmaceutical analogy, the second sort of learning I've had is just using, in fact, now with COVID, this is even more relevant, is you have to be able to unlike software, you take a lot more bets in data science, and you need to be able to time restrict these bets. I was a grad student in ML, and contrary to what every PhD wants to do, who they can work on this stuff for years. And in many cases, like in software, I do believe that working deeper actually makes the chances of success higher. Whereas in data-driven products, time restricting it, trying a different path, trying a different approach, trying even a different problem is actually better than trying. If you're going to crack a data science problem, you're going to crack it in a spreadsheet with a lightweight model on day 7, day 10, rather than in month 3, right? If you're taking the same approach. So time restricting these projects, taking many bets. And by many bets, I don't mean, trying to solve different problems. I'm saying trying to solve the same problem or in different ways. Looking at different proxies of data, different models to try to solve it rather than taking a singular path. And in terms of hiring, what's really fascinating after building data science teams over a decade, I think what I've learned the most is that it is better to retool your engineers and your data engineers to become proficient in data science than actually completely giving that over to a data science organization. And there are many good things that have happened if you do that. One, your engineers actually who understand the product are more likely to have a production ready data science product, and it's also a way that they feel increases retention in the company. They feel like they're learning new skills. I've also found that having a small data science organization which acts as a consultant to the other engineers who are building models is very, very effective as a method to scale this out. I'm not saying that you should not hire a PhD level data scientist. I think what I'm also saying is that it is much more effective to train an engineer to become a data engineer, data scientist, than it is actually to take a data scientist and have them become a good engineer, right? It takes a much longer time, and I have done that. It takes years to convert a PhD data scientist to become a great engineer, but it's a lot faster to take an engineer and have them become a productive data science, machine learning engineer. And the other sort of things I've learned building data science products or data-driven products is, you really have to leave, once after many years of failing constantly, from 2012, I think I started get these things working 2016, 17. What I learned is you have to leave all the academics learnings back outside and really look at the problem in its complete naked form and try to solve it from first principles, then apply what the state of the art actually is. What's fascinating about data scientists is that depending on when they graduated, they have their favorite tool or model they want to use. And I won't pick on anybody. Mine was probably like, anyways, I was later than naive Bayes, but earlier than deep learning. But depending on the generation when they graduated, they have different favorite tools. What I've learned is you have to check, not worry about the theory as much, look at every problem uniquely and find the fastest way, like in a startup, to solve the problem in the simplest possible way, And what I've also found is that all big data problems actually have a 60-70% solution in a spreadsheet. So why not try that first in 7 days and get to it as quickly as possible? And the last sort of thing that I will leave with is that to make data science problems and projects successful, products as I think about it, but this applies if you're a big company and you want to make data science projects work, is focus a lot on the post AI workflow. Nobody will log into your application. Nobody wants a recommendation. It sounds all very clever. It may be able to raise money, but nobody actually cares about your recommendation. Yeah, nobody actually cares about your ranking. if you're going to actually make data science work, think about what action you can take in the real world, because people are too busy to log into your app and click on some recommendations. They're not going to do it, and then the whole thing will fail, because unless something happens in the real world, it doesn't matter what recommendations you're making. So think about the workflow. It takes a lot of effort. This is a workflow diagram of what complexity is behind some notification at Slack, right? So while something is super simple, you want to think about how to take action as much as possible automatically, how to meet the user where they are, intervening with their day-to-day workflow from your AI, based application, rather than providing them with some insight or some recommendation or some ranking or some score. Nobody cares about those things. And that's another sort of, common mistake I see with folks trying to do things. And then a year and a half later, we find that nobody logged into your recommendation app, and you've just, I've done some consulting work where they've spent $100 million on some data being captured from an oil rig, and then the plant manager did not, hasn't logged in because they're too busy and did not even know the password. But I don't want to leave you guys with a negative. The reality is the magic is actually there. When it happens, we we use things like Google Maps every day, and it's magical when it tells you that this stuff is, you got to leave now to get to Oakland on time, and that is a lot, as much as a workflow and data integration as it is machine learning. You need all the pieces to work together to create that magic. So that's my talk. I'll pause there. Hi. I guess I can talk a little bit more about what I've learned, or we can talk about Q&A. How would you like to do that, April?
Yeah, let me first open it up for questions, and just everyone put it in the chat, and I'll come back to that. I wanted to say it's a pretty alarming set of statistics that you provided about the failure of data science projects, and I think it really speaks to why all of us are on this, today's summit, and hopefully tomorrow's as well, because I think there's a lot of pitfalls that we can avoid to make sure that we learn from people like you who can give us some of those pieces of advice and make sure that it is successful, because I know everybody puts their heart and their soul and their time and energy and blood, sweat, and tears and late nights and all of this. And so whatever you can do to make sure it's a success is definitely, really, really important. I don't know if you have, sort of, I kind of asked this to the last speaker as well, but are there like 3 top pieces of advice that you've learned the hard way that you can impart to today's audience to help them avoid those same lessons through experiencing it, but maybe just learning from you, so they don't have
Yeah,
to repeat the same mistakes?
right. I think the most common mistake is, you know, focusing on the right problems and not be focusing on data science and worrying about the technology first. You have to, certainly in a company which is a startup, you have to really identify what's the blockbuster problem, the drug you want to solve first, and then apply the data science. You don't want to be able to look for the different holes just because you have a, you know GPT-3 knowledge and you want to apply it to
Mhm.
all the places it could work. I think you want to find the blockbuster drug. You want to be able to start from that and then apply the shortest possible way to success. There's a very good chance that, which is the second cause of the common failure, is that you just don't have data and to solve the problem. So if you're going to do
Mhm.
data-driven projects, you need enough data, you need enough of the right data to be able to solve the problem. And often what happens is companies don't have the data. And the third mistake they do is they say, well, we can just crowdsource the data. There are enough labeling technologies out there um, that could just label my data. It could be document labeling. It could be, any kind of hand training of data, labeled data. I actually find that it is impossible to label data. You can do it at small scale to test things out, but at scale, when you're building machine learning based problems, you need constant stream of labeled data. It leads to a lot of failures. I understand that there are companies like at Google who have their, you know, teams and teams of people who are labeling data, and then now there are tons of startups who'll do it for you. But I've never found that to be a path of success. In fact, what I found is that unsupervised models that use or semi-supervised models that use proxies of labeled data are much more likely to be successful than taking a massive effort to find labeled data. It doesn't exist. The most successful path is that if your workflow, your application is generating some proxy and you apply some unsupervised models, that is more likely to be successful than, there are lots of new startups now. They'll help you label data like what was available for Facebook and Google. But I think it works in limited cases. In most of the cases, I found that in the real world, there is nothing called training data. Why do we still keep on doing it? Because going back to the same problem, in academia, when you're doing your PhD, you're provided with the training data. You're provided with the perfect sample data because it was there for a competition and the goal was to sort of solve that problem. But in the real world, that doesn't exist. And that's why applying a lot of principles and techniques that work in academia don't translate directly to industry. And that is the second or third sort of, I mean, there are infinite things I've learned, but finding the right team, mixing your engineers with data scientists, embedding the data scientists, starting with that org structure is right, figuring out the key problem that is your blockbuster drug, your biggest ROI, figuring out paths to it, avoiding the misnomer that label data exists or you can label data, because the world is constantly changing. It turns out the second you label data, there's a data drift, and you come out of sync from the real world as soon as and there's a long tail of data. So to really learn machine learning well, you need to be able to learn from the long tail, because you will run into the long tail eventually as you scale your product or business. So these are some of the non-intuitive counter anti-patterns, if I may, that we often see in building machine learning applications.
What are some of the ways that that you've found that blockbuster drug? What are there sort of key, indicators or anything that tips you off that you've used in the past to say, eureka, this is it. It's a light bulb moment. This is going to be the big ROI.
I think that question is as much a product problem as it is a data science problem. Obviously, the data scientist in me will declare victory as soon as we see some high level F score or precision recall, but that often is also misleading as an indicator of success. So it's the same thing that, if the vaccine worked on a petri dish, killing the virus, they don't roll that out to millions of people, right? What do? You run clinical trials. So phase 1, phase 2, phase 3. You kind of, in data science, have to do the same way. You have to have your early adopters to understand how does your your model and your machine learning predictions or classification or recommendations intervene with the human workflow. How do they react? What is the full picture? So you have to constantly interact with the real world. Yes, you want in a week or two to get some indication with small amounts of data that yeah, this is working. If that doesn't work, then all bets are off. And that's why you need a pipeline approach where you're doing a lot of experiments, and then you take certain experiments forward and do real world testing with small amounts of people. And then if that works, then you do further testing with more people. So again, the closer you keep it to looking at like a pharmaceutical trial, the more likely it is to work. Because what happens often is that I've seen infinite models where not infinite, but a majority of the models which had really good early results, but they did not work in the real world. Why? Because all machine learning models are working over a proxy of the real world. The data you have you're training on is a proxy of the real world, right? It is not the real world. It's still data about the real world. So, and most likely it's not even data exactly about the problem you're solving. As I mentioned, it's most likely a proxy around the problem you're solving. So classic use case, would be Google search, for example, or PageRank. It's looking at links to infer what's the meaning or what should be ranked or what's the authority on that keyword. That's just a proxy. It's an artifact of what the actual question is, right? And often the proxy is not good enough. So you want to be able to find early success at low scale, what I call in a spreadsheet at low data. And then if that moves forward, then you build, even at low scale, how does it intervene with the human workflow first? And then further on, then you say, okay, that's working. So not only is working at low scale in the lab or in a model, it's also able to make some positive effect in the real world through a workflow or some integration with the problem you're trying to solve. And then you scale both. You scale the machine learning model, the data behind it, and you scale the workflow, the application component around it at the same time. But what you don't want to do is over engineer the machine learning model, which is the classic engineering problem. And the classic data science problem is they got in 74% precision, and they can spend the next 2 years trying to get to 78% or 90%, and probably won't never happen. So the early indicator is if you can get close to 70, 80% precision recall, then there's a shot at it. If you're at 30% in a week, you're not going to be able to get to 90% in 3 years. So there's a very good chance that your early indicator of success is probably your final indicator of success. And again, that is different than software, right? In software, if you have a broken product, you have tons of problems, and it doesn't work, with enough effort, enough investment, enough smart people, you can get there. But in data science, I found you just can't get there because you may not have the data, you may not be able to actually solve the problem, the technology may not exist to solve it. The machine learning models, depending on what kind of data you have, may not be good enough to be able to solve it. So those are sort of the learnings I've had as doing this now dozens and dozens of times, mostly failing, as I said, but being successful maybe in machine learning 30, 40 times.
Yeah, it's impressive. It's very impressive. Yeah, I like Micah Huff put in here, key learning from your experience at Demandbase is making sure that humans can solve some version of the problem before applying to machine learning. So I think that's really, really smart. And yeah, and it is that kind of academic to real life example where we know we all know things that work theoretically, but in practice don't really work. So I think this is a nice extension of that. Makes a lot of sense to me.
Yeah, I can elaborate what Micah actually means.
Yeah,
Right?
let's hear that. Yeah.
So basically, the learning we had was that there are lots of data scientists out there that are trying to solve problems, and they may be successful that humans cannot solve, right? Like proving a theorem and stuff like that. And that is true. But in the real world, the highest chance of success is if a human can solve that problem very well at low scale. So, I can identify that this is a book. It's called The Cold Start Problem, and I can read it. So as a human, I can get it pretty much right every single time. I think I can read mostly correctly. And that's a good chance that a human can solve the problem before you applying a machine learning technique. There's no point trying to solve a problem that some expert human cannot solve at high precision. And the reason is that if you get a machine to solve it, there's a very good chance you wouldn't even know if you're making progress or not, because you can't actually test your solution because humans are not really good at solving that problem. And then there'll be confusion around, you know, uh, if you're right or wrong. The other interesting thing I found is that in most machine learning solutions, two humans rarely actually agree. You would think that if you get a simple enough task, the fact that this is a business book, let's say somebody was going to read the title and say this is a business book, you can only get two experts agreeing at about 90% of the time. So even human experts don't agree often enough or perfectly. So you want to be able to go after problems where humans can solve it at low scale. Also, you don't want to go after problems, continuing with Micah's recommendation, where the cost of failure is very high. So let me give you a perfect example. There are infinite problems in the world that you can solve with machine learning where ROI is high. If humans are really good at it and it doesn't need to scale, like, I don't know, flight traffic control, right? Very, very dangerous thing for AI to taking control of it. Humans are able to solve it. They're pretty darn good at it. We don't have that many airlines crashing into each other, and that's why it's not to screw with problems like that. There are infinite problems, so the types of problems you want to identify, which are blockbuster, are humans are able to solve it at low scale, but unable to solve it at large scale. They have high ROI if they are to be solved at large scale. So, Google Maps, for example, somebody can study the map at low scale and solve the problem, but it takes a lot of time and you want to be able to do it all the time, constantly at large scale everywhere in the world. So those are the traits of problems you want to go after, and then build the right organization, and everything else will tend to work out.
Yep. Yeah, I like that a lot. I'm assuming that you've never seen it work, that something that didn't work in the human version actually worked when applied to machine learning, right? Is there ever been, I'm sure somebody's thinking, I'm sure it doesn't always work that way, but have you ever seen it work or it didn't work, in the entry level stages, but miraculously somehow worked later on in ML?
It is possible, but it will be almost counterintuitive to get there, because if it didn't
Yep.
work and humans couldn't solve it or identify that it's working, then if the machine is actually making it work, we still can't identify it. Now, it is possible that there may be an objective measure by which we can measure it. So, for example, drug discovery is a process where ML is being applied to make things work, where humans are not able to reconnect or solve the problem at low scale. I don't know how many drugs have been discovered that way, but I understand it does work. Um, but it is much more rare. It is much more easier to go after problems, because then if the machine is working and the model is working, you can go to a human saying, yeah, this works, right? Look, it's the answer. This is a business book. They're like, yeah, it is. But if humans can't do that, then you're just get confused, right? Like, okay, is it really
Mm-hmm.
working or is it not working? You may have a tertiary objective, like there are lots of machine learning objectives, like, oh, we're selling more widgets on our website, so it must be working, right? And you could have such an
Yeah.
objective, yet you don't know why, and is it really working, or is it just the fact that it's December and people are buying more stuff? So it's a
Mm-hmm.
dangerous place to be if you end up in a
Right.
situation where ML is working, but you don't have a human to corroborate it.
Yeah. Yeah. And I'm sure it takes a lot more patience to do it the right way, as we're discussing. So it requires a lot more discipline. Yeah. Very good. Well, any final thoughts before we take our break?
No, I mean, hopefully these patterns and anti-patterns are useful. I do think that while I'm, I've shared some of the failures, that this is the future, right? This has to work. It will take time. It requires a lot of thought. Be wary of trying to solve the problem just because you have a data scientist who could apply some latest new finagle thing that they learned right when they were graduating. Um, you know, and which is true for every discipline. So I'm hopefully not saying something too unique to data science, but it happens to be more of a problem there. And I'm a data scientist too, so I'm nothing against data scientists. So hopefully that was helpful. Thank you for having
Very,
me
very
give you talk.
helpful.